He didn't lock her in a basement. He gave her an office. 42nd floor, floor-to-ceiling glass, facing Burrard Inlet, a standing desk, 3 monitors humming with quiet efficiency, and a leather chair that cost more than 2 months of Imara's rent. The coffee was already made when she arrived. Dark roast, no sugar, no cream, which was correct, which meant someone had been watching her long enough to know how she took it. The door didn't have a lock. Navarre had simply taken her phone. That was what she kept returning to as she stood at the window, watching the last of the evening light die over the water. Not the 2 men who had escorted her from the lobby of the logistics firm where she worked. Not the black SUV, the tinted windows, the 40-minute drive up the mountain in total silence. Not even the fact that she had been placed in a glass tower belonging to one of the most dangerous men in the province of British Columbia, without anyone asking whether she wanted to be here. Just the phone, gone clean professional like an HR policy. She turned away from the window and sat down at the desk. The monitors were already loaded. She recognized the software, a version of the accounting suite she used every day, but with access permissions she had never been granted at the firm. 12 layers of accounts. Holding companies nested inside trusts, nested inside shell entities, registered in 3 different provinces. It was a beautiful mess, the kind of structure that was meant to be impenetrable. Imara had worked in logistics, accounting for 4 years, ever since she left Winnipeg with $200 and the last name of a father who had made it very clear she was on her own. She had never finished her degree, but she could read a balance sheet the way other people read a sentence, instantly, intuitively, with a complete understanding of what was missing. And something was missing here. She could feel it the way you feel a missing tooth with your tongue. Urgent, specific, impossible to stop noticing. She pulled up the first set of ledgers and reached for the coffee. Navarre didn't appear until nearly 11 o'clock. The door opened without a knock. He was tall. She registered that first, and carrying the particular stillness of a man who had spent a long time making sure no one could read him. Dark hair, collar open, a jacket that probably cost more than her car. A scar ran from his jaw to the base of his throat, pale against the olive of his skin, old enough to be fully healed and still impossible to ignore. He looked at her sitting at the desk, surrounded by printed ledger pages she had spread across the floor in a pattern only she understood, and his expression did not change at all. "You're not panicking," he said. "There's no point." Imara did not look up from the screen. "You didn't bring me here to scare me. You brought me here because you need something." A pause. He walked farther into the room and stood to the side of the desk, looking at the papers on the floor the way a general surveys a map. "How long have you known?" "About the bleed in the accounts." She finally looked at him. His eyes were dark, calculating. Not cruel, not warm, purely analytical. She recognized that look. She saw it in her own reflection every morning, since March. "I sent 3 internal memos to my supervisor, flagging the variance in the subsidiary transfers. He didn't respond to any of them." "He works for me," Navarre said. "I know that now." "He also works for someone else." The line of his jaw tightened. "Has been for the last 8 months." Imara looked back at the screen. She moved the cursor to a column she had highlighted in red and turned the monitor slightly toward him. "Then you have a problem with your routing codes. Whoever is moving money out of your holding accounts is using a lag in your reconciliation cycle. The transfer's clear before the end-of-month audit window. It's clean. It would have taken years to catch if someone wasn't looking at the daily variance." She paused. "I was looking at the daily variance." Navarre studied the screen. Something shifted in his posture, barely perceptible, a fraction of tension releasing somewhere behind his shoulders. "How much have they taken?" "In the last 8 months." Imara turned back to the keyboard. "Give me 20 minutes." He sat down in the chair against the wall and waited. He was very good at waiting. She could feel his attention on her back. Not threatening, just present, the way a stone is present. Constant, unmoving. She worked through the numbers with the same methodical focus she brought to everything, tracing the thread of the fraud through every subsidiary and correspondent account it touched, and when she had the figure, she printed the summary and set it on the desk between them. He read it without touching it. His face stayed perfectly blank. 4.3 million, he said. 4.3182. Imara folded her hands on the desk. And change. Navarre picked up the paper. He read it again, slowly this time, and she could see him working through the implications. Not just the money, but the map of it. Who knew what? Who touched which accounts? Where the loyalty lines had fractured. He looked like a man doing arithmetic on the structural integrity of the floor beneath his feet. "Who else have you told?" he asked. "No one." "The memos?" "Went to a man who works for you, as you just explained." Imara met his gaze. "I'm a very good accountant, Mr. Navarre. I'm not suicidal." Something crossed his face. It was gone in half a second, but she caught it. Something between surprise and reluctant respect. He set the paper down and stood. "You'll stay here tonight. There are staff on the lower floors. Clara will bring you anything you need. And tomorrow." He was already at the door. He stopped without turning around. "Tomorrow we find out how deep this goes." The room where she slept was not a cell. It was a guest suite with linen sheets, a private bathroom, and a view of the North Shore mountains that turned pink and gold at dawn. Imara stood at the window with a cup of tea and watched the light change and thought, very deliberately, about the practical facts of her situation. She was on the 42nd floor of a building with private elevator access only. Her phone was gone. She had no idea where Navarre kept the exit codes for the parking garage. The two men who had escorted her the previous evening were, as far as she could tell, stationed somewhere in the building. Running was not impossible. There were always stairs, always a lobby, always a public street eventually. But it was inadvisable until she understood what she was running from and what she was running into. She was also, if she was being truthful with herself, not particularly interested in running. The accounts were a puzzle. They were the most complex, deliberate piece of financial engineering she had ever seen, and someone had been picking them apart from the inside for 8 months. The part of her brain that had spent 4 years quietly cataloguing every variance and anomaly in a firm she had always suspected was not entirely legitimate, was fully, embarrassingly engaged. She drank her tea and went back to the desk. By noon she had reconstructed the full transfer chain, 11 accounts, 6 holding entities, 3 provincial registrations and 1 offshore correspondent in the Cayman Islands. The fraud was elegant. She would give whoever had designed it that much, but it was also overconfident, the kind of design that assumed no one would ever pull the thread. She printed everything, organized it in chronological order, paper-clipped the corresponding account statements behind each summary page, and was annotating the final exhibit when Navarre appeared in the doorway. He had slept even less than she had. She could tell by the precise way he was holding himself upright, controlled, deliberate, the posture of a man fighting his own fatigue with sheer willpower. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee, which she had not expected, and he set one on the corner of her desk without a word. She picked it up, dark roast, no sugar, still correct. "Sit down," she said, not looking up from her notes. "I need you to look at something." He sat. She turned the first exhibit toward him and began walking him through it, keeping her voice even and her explanations precise. He asked 2 questions. Both were good ones. He understood the structure faster than she expected, for someone whose expertise was presumably not financial forensics, and when she reached the final page he sat back and looked at the ceiling for a long moment. "Gallagher," he said. She waited. "My operations director." His voice was flat, not angry. Flat in the way of something that has used up all its available emotion and arrived at pure fact. 20 years, he held my brother's hand when he was dying. He looked back down at the papers. "He's been selling my shipment schedules to a competing outfit for 8 months, and he paid for it with my own money." "Yes," Imara said, "that's what the accounts say." "How long until he realizes I know?" "If he's monitoring the access logs, which he is, or he wouldn't have gotten this far without triggering an audit flag. He'll notice the change in the authorization pattern the moment you pull his credentials. That gives you a window of approximately, she glanced at the time, 6 hours before he assumes he's been found. Navarre looked at her. There was something in his face she hadn't seen there before. Not warmth exactly. More like the way a mathematician looks at an equation that has just resolved itself. "What do you want?" he asked. She looked at him steadily. "What do you mean?" "You could have left last night. The stairwell door on the 39th floor doesn't require a code from the inside. You would have been on the street in 12 minutes. He paused. "You didn't leave." Imara was quiet for a moment. Outside, a seaplane banked low over the inlet, heading south toward the airport. She watched it until it disappeared behind the tree line. "I'm owed 7 months of salary adjustments," she said. "Your man at the firm held up my pay reviews 3 times. Told me I wasn't a full-time employee of record, which is a lie because I processed my own onboarding paperwork and I know exactly what my employment status is." She turned back to face Navarre. "I want what I'm owed, and I want it in writing." He was silent for 4 full seconds. Then slowly something that was not quite a smile moved across his face. "All right," he said. They worked through the afternoon together. Navarre pulled a second chair to the desk and sat beside her, closer than was professionally necessary, but neither of them acknowledged it, and they moved through the account structure with a shared, quiet focus that felt, Imara thought, oddly comfortable for 2 people who had met 17 hours ago. He knew his own operation better than she expected. She knew the accounts better than anyone else alive. Together they built a clear picture of not just the fraud but the entire hidden architecture of how it had been concealed. At one point she reached across him to indicate a figure on the far monitor, and her shoulder brushed his arm. He went very still. She felt the stillness, that specific, careful absence of motion, and pulled back without comment, and they continued working, and neither of them mentioned it. At 6 in the evening, a man named Danson knocked and entered without waiting. He was built like a highway barrier and smelled of cigarettes, and he looked at Imara with the kind of suspended disbelief usually reserved for finding unexpected wildlife indoors. He spoke to Navarre in a low, rapid undertone. The word Gallagher came up 3 times. "He moved the remainder of the funds this afternoon," Navarre said when Danson had left. "How much?" "Everything that was left in the secondary holding, another 900,000. Imara had already pulled up the correspondent account. She watched the transaction timestamp populate on the screen in real time. "He's routing it to the Cayman correspondent," she said, "but the authorization chain requires a secondary approval code that resets every 24 hours. She looked at him. "Who generates that code?" "My operations director," Navarre said. A pause. "Did." "Then he won't have the new code yet." Imara's fingers were already moving. "If I can access the issuance log, I can build a block on the correspondent side before the transfer clears. It's a 12-hour hold. Standard fraud prevention protocol. It buys you time." Navarre looked at the screen. "Can you do that?" "I've been managing your secondary authorization flags for 4 years without knowing why." She entered the pathway and turned to face him. "I need your executive-level credentials, the ones Gallagher didn't have access to." He held her gaze for a long moment. She could feel the calculation behind his eyes. Not distrust exactly, but the careful accounting of a man who measured everything in terms of risk and return. Then he reached past her, entered a credential string she deliberately did not read, and sat back. "Thank you," she said. She built the block in 11 minutes. When it confirmed, she printed the audit trail and clipped it to the back of the Cayman correspondence file. Then she sat back and looked at the darkening window. Her hands were shaking slightly. She pressed them flat against her thighs so he wouldn't see it. "He'll know now," she said. "Yes." "Will he run?" "He'll try." Navarre's voice was very quiet. "He won't get far." He stood and walked to the window, putting his back to her. The lights of the North Shore had come on, scattered and amber in the early dark. He stood there for a long while. Imara watched him without meaning to. The set of his shoulders, the way he kept his weight slightly off his left side, an old favoritism that suggested an old injury. The scar on his jaw caught the light. He looked, she thought, genuinely and profoundly alone. "I'm sorry about Gallagher," she said. He turned. He looked surprised that she had said it. 20 years is a long time to trust someone, she said. She wasn't looking for a response, just stating a fact. It's worse when the numbers are impersonal about it. They don't care that he held your brother's hand. They just show you the transfer timestamps. Navarre was quiet. "You went through the files on the firm's server," he said finally. "The sealed partition." She looked at him levelly. "You gave me 3 monitors and full access permissions. I used them." "You read my brother's probate file." "I read the medical billing, which was in the same partition. Your brother was sick for a long time." She paused. "I'm sorry about that too." He turned back to the window. For several minutes, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the building settled around them. The low mechanical breath of the climate system, the distant percussion of the elevator. "The firm," Navarre said finally. "Once this is resolved, it won't operate the same way. The structure changes." He paused. "Your position changes." "I assumed." "I'm offering you a different one." Imara looked at the papers stacked on the desk. 4 months of withheld pay adjustments. 7 memos that went unread. 4 years of keeping her head down and her numbers immaculate in a firm she had always known, at some deep animal level, was not the kind of place where a woman from Winnipeg with half a commerce degree was supposed to make herself indispensable. She had done it anyway. Out of spite, mostly. Out of the particular stubbornness that her father had called a defect, and that she had privately considered her best quality. "What kind of position?" she asked. "The one you've been doing for the last 18 hours. He finally turned from the window to face her. The analytical distance was back in his expression, but something underneath it had shifted. Something that looked a great deal like respect that had stopped trying to stay contained. "You see everything. You don't panic. You work the problem." He paused. "I haven't had that in a long time." "You had Gallagher." "I had someone who pretended to be that." He crossed back to the desk and stood in front of it, not behind it, an unconscious positioning that put them on the same level. "You're not pretending." Imara was quiet for a moment. "I have conditions," she said. "Tell me." "Back pay in full, structured as a contractor settlement. I'll draft the paperwork myself. An actual employment contract this time, with a defined scope and a defined term." She looked at him steadily. "And I want full read access to every account structure you operate. No partitions, no sealed files. If you want me to keep this from bleeding, I need to see all of it." Something passed through his expression that she couldn't quite name. "All of it," he repeated. "All of it." She didn't look away. "Because whoever comes after Gallagher will try the same thing, or something smarter. You need someone who can see it before it happens, not after." He ran all the variables. She let him. She was good at waiting too. "Agreed," he said. She nodded and turned back to the desk, organizing the files into the order in which she would present them tomorrow. She was 2 pages deep when she realized he hadn't moved. She looked up. He was watching her with an expression she had no framework for, open, slightly off balance, like a man who had just realized the room he was standing in was larger than he had measured. He looked, for just a moment, very tired. Not the controlled tiredness he had been carrying since she arrived, but something older and heavier underneath it. The kind of tired that has nothing to do with sleep. "You could still leave," he said. "Tonight. I'll have Danson drive you wherever you want to go." "You said that before." "I mean it more now." He picked up the top file and set it back down, a restless, uncharacteristic gesture. "Once you sign a contract with me, there's no clean line anymore. You know that." "I've been keeping your books for 4 years without knowing it," Imara said. "I crossed that line a long time ago." She turned back to her papers. "I'd rather do it with my eyes open and be compensated correctly." He let out a short breath. It wasn't quite a laugh, but it was adjacent to one, the sound of something releasing that had been held too long. He picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, set it back down. "Get some sleep," he said, moving toward the door. Navarre. He stopped. "The block on the Cayman account holds until 7 tomorrow morning." She did not look up. "Gallagher will try to reverse it through the correspondent bank directly. He has the account number, and if he still has contacts in the authorization chain, he can attempt a manual override. You need someone monitoring the communications line from 5 a.m. Danson handles. Danson handles enforcement." She finally looked at him. "I handle the money. Those are different things. I'll be at the desk at 5. She paused. "Make sure the coffee is ready." He stood in the doorway looking at her with that expression again. The one she still didn't have a name for, and then he gave a single nod and left. She listened to his footsteps recede down the hall. Even those were controlled, measured, the walk of a man who had spent a long time making sure he took up exactly the amount of space he intended, and no more. She turned back to the monitors. The account structures glowed on the screen, 12 layers deep, full of other people's secrets and other people's money, and for the first time in 4 years of keeping her head down in a job she had always been too smart for, something settled in Imara's chest like a lock clicking open. She worked until 2 in the morning. At 5 a.m. exactly, she was at the desk when the first override attempt came through the correspondent bank. She caught it in 4 minutes, flagged the authorization number, and cross-referenced it against the access log she had built the previous evening. The number belonged to a junior accountant at the correspondent institution, someone Gallagher had cultivated, probably the same patient, invisible way he had cultivated everything over 20 years. She blocked the override, documented the incident chain, and had a clean summary printed by the time Navarre appeared in the doorway at 6:45, carrying 2 cups of coffee and the look of a man who had also not slept. He read the summary without sitting down. When he finished, he set it on the desk and looked at her. There was nothing analytical in his expression now. It was quieter than that, more direct. "You caught it," he said. "That's what you're keeping me for." He set one of the coffees beside her hand without being asked. She picked it up. He sat down in the chair against the wall, leaned his head back, and closed his eyes. She let him. She turned back to her work and let him rest in the one room in his building where he could apparently afford to. And she finished the last of the account documentation while the city woke up 42 floors below them, and the mountains went pale and pink along their edges. Later she would think that was the moment, not the hours at the desk, not the blocked transfer, not the contract they would sign 2 days later. The moment was that quiet, him with his eyes closed, finally trusting something in the room to hold, and her working through his numbers with the kind of care she reserved for things that mattered to her, which was not something she gave easily and not something she gave without deciding to. She had decided. By noon, Gallagher's accounts were formally seized. By the following Monday, Imara had an employment contract, correctly dated, correctly structured, signed by both parties. The back pay arrived in her account on Tuesday as a contractor settlement, which was, as she had specified, the cleanest way to handle it. She worked out of the 42nd floor from then on. Her desk faced the water. The chair was very good. The coffee was always correct, and nobody asked her to explain why she needed to see all of it, and nobody called her memos optional reading again. Navarre used her first name exactly once that first week, quietly, at the end of a long evening, when they were the last 2 people on the floor and the city below had gone mostly dark. She had caught an error in a report he was about to send, and he had looked at the correction and then at her and said softly, "Imara." Not a question, not a command. Just the name itself, the way you say the name of something you have decided to be careful with. She looked up from the screen. "The contract," he said, "the defined term, 1 year." "Yes. I want to renegotiate that." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the screen, pulled up the contract file, and moved the cursor to the term clause. "Tell me what you want to change," she said. and I'll tell you what it's going to cost you." He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him looking at the side of her face. "Fair enough," he said. She didn't let herself smile until he had turned back to his own monitor. Then she allowed herself the briefest, sharpest curve at the corner of her mouth, the kind she reserved for problems solved, for numbers that balanced, for the precise satisfaction of knowing exactly where every figure was and what it was worth. She had come to this city with $200 and a last name she had mostly stopped using. She had spent 4 years keeping meticulous records for a firm that never bothered to read them. She had crossed no lines she hadn't already been standing on, and she had done it with her eyes open and her accounts in order. The most dangerous thing in any empire, she had learned, was not the man at the top. It was the woman who knew exactly where all the money was buried, and had already decided what to do with it.